Hello! Have you got a radiator in your house that's not getting hot? In this video, I'm going to show you everything that I would do to try and get a radiator back up and running again. From bleeding the radiator to checking in the radiator valves are actually turned on to thermostatic radiator valves being stuck, which is probably the #1 reason for a radiator not being hot, to the more advanced stuff where I start taking radiators apart and flushing out pipework. And like I said, all these methods I use to try and get a radiator hot again. Because there's nothing worse than having your house nice and warm and yet there's a warm room which is freezing cold because that radiator just won't come on. At the end of the video, I'll give you a checklist that you can run through to make sure that you've covered everything you possibly can to get that radiator back up and running again. Just before I get on with it, I want to quickly let you know that down in the description there are lots of other links to help videos which I've made. And if you visit my website, you'll find there are over 100 videos to answer all your questions about your gas boiler and your heating. Right, now let's get on with it and show you how to get that radiator hot again. Right, so we've got a radiator that's not getting hot. So the first thing I would do is obviously turn the heating on and check all the other radiators are getting hot. Then I'm going to go back to my problem radiator and feel it all over and see if it feels at all hot. Now if your radiator is hot at the bottom or part way up, but it's cold at the top, then that just means the radiator needs to be bled. So there's air in the top of the radiator and we just need to let that air out, which is called bleeding, and then the radiator will be full of water right to the top. So we take our radiator key, we put it into the bleed point, undo the bleed screw. You'll then hear some hissing as the air comes out of the radiator. Then we just close it again as soon as we get a little bit of water coming out. Have an old cloth or a bit of kitchen paper to catch the water when it comes out, and it's a really good idea to put an old towel on the floor just in case you spill some of the water, because sometimes it can be really dirty and it will stain your carpets. Now just a quick note regarding the keys you use to bleed the radiator. Old radiators have a slightly different size bleed valve. It's slightly smaller than on newer radiators. You can see how this new radiator key is really loose, and yet this old Imperial key is nice and tight. So you really want an Imperial bleed key to bleed these old radiators. And one last note, these white things on the end, they are supposed to rotate so you can move the hole around to make it easier to catch the water. Just before you go bleeding your radiators, a very important point if you have a combination boiler or a system boiler. So that's a sealed system where you have a pressure gauge. When you bleed your radiators, you're going to lower the pressure on your system and that may stop the boiler from working. So this is very important, so before you go bleeding your radiators, make sure that you know how to top the system back up again. And normally the pressure should be between 1 and 1.5 bar. If you have an open vented system where you have a loft tank to fill the system, then you don't need to worry about this pressure. So hopefully that's got your radiator working again if the radiator's hot at the bottom and cold at the top. Now moving on, if your pipework is hot, so if one of the pipes is hot or maybe both of them are hot, but the radiator is cold, then you can pretty much guarantee that either one or both of the radiator valves are turned off. Now this may sound silly, but the number of times people say to me, my radiator is definitely turned on, but when I go and check it, it's definitely turned off. So don't forget, if you haven't got a thermostatic radiator valve, you may have 2 wheel head valves on your radiator and you need to make sure that both of those are turned on. Or if you've got a thermostat and a lock shield on the other end, make sure that the lock shield is turned on. To demonstrate this, here I am with a small adjustable spanner and I'm opening up this valve. Now sometimes I must agree that it is hard to tell whether the valve is open or closed. Now quite often these valves can become seized up, so that's why I'm using the adjustable spanner. Now this type of valve is called a lock shield valve and you can't turn this cap. You have to remove the cap and then use an adjustable spanner to check how open or closed the valve is. And this should be used to balance the system. Now if this valve has been used to balance the system, you may find it's only a couple of turns open, but you should count how many turns it takes to close the valve and then open it back up by the same amount. But on this occasion I'm going to fully open it because I want to get the radiator working. And then once I've got the radiator working, I can then look at balancing the radiator again. I've got a separate video all about balancing your system. And if you're not sure which way to turn your radiator valve, you turn it left, so that's anti-clockwise to open the valve, and you close it clockwise, which is to the right, to close the valve. A really useful little saying my children taught me is lefty-loosey, righty-tighty. Now, the most common reason I find for a radiator not being hot is a thermostatic radiator valve has become stuck. Of course, that's only if you have a thermostat fitted on your radiator. Now, here's a thermostatic radiator valve, and this radiator is not getting hot. So I can remove the head just by undoing the knurled nut underneath. Sometimes they're tight and you need to use a pair of pliers to undo them. But then you can see there's a pin in the middle of the valve here. Now that pin I can see is stuck down. And if I just press it just quickly, it suddenly pops up. You can now see that the pin moves up and down quite freely. And now literally that radiator will now be getting hot. Now, just to be clear here, this pin is connected to the rubber washer which closes the valve. And when the valve is kept closed for a long period of time, say over the summer because the thermostatic radiator valve has been turned down to a lower temperature, when it's opened back up in the winter, the rubber washer can sometimes remain stuck to the seating, keeping the valve closed. Now here's another radiator which is cold, the valve is also cold, but the pipework is hot. Now that last valve opened up really easily, but most of the time they need a little bit of agitation to get them to open up. Now not every thermostatic head comes off in the same way. Now this old Danfoss valve I have to undo a screw which then loosens the clamp, then I can pull the thermostatic valve head off. Now some people recommend using a pair of pliers now, holding the pin and pulling the pin out with a pair of pliers. Now I don't recommend doing that because I know people who've actually done that. They've pulled the pin and then the pins actually come out. And then they've had red hot dirty water spraying out of the hole left in the radiator valve. Plus you've probably scratched the pin which may start it leaking. So this is a method which I've been using for the last 30 years. And that's to just take my hammer and very gently just tap the pin. And you can see with just a couple of taps, the pin pops out. I can now push the pin in and out, which is opening and closing the valve. So there's just a spring which pushes the valve back open. Now I'm not going crazy here, I'm literally just tapping the pin, just enough to close the valve, where it then just springs back open. And there we go. I'm happy with that now, and the radiator is getting nice and hot. So by tapping the pin, it vibrates the rubber washer, allowing it to become unstuck from its seating, and the spring pushes the valve back open. Now you can get a little bit of silicone grease and just put it on the pin. I'll then push the pin in and out a few more times just to try and get some of that silicone grease down inside the valve, which will then hopefully lubricate the pin a little bit. Once I've done that, I can then replace the head. And now this thermostatic valve is working fine and the radiator is getting nice and hot. Now I have made a more detailed video about thermostatic radiator valves and how to fix them, because I would say this is the #1 reason for a radiator not being hot. So now you've bled your radiator, you've checked that the valves are open and the thermostatic valve is not stuck, but your radiator is still cold. Now, a question customers will often ask me is, do I think the system needs to be flushed out? And the answer to that is probably not. Now, whilst magnetite, that's that black stuff in the bottom of the radiators, is a problem for your system, I very rarely find it where it is that bad that it stops radiators from working. If you've got a newer system, so I'm saying 10 to 20 years old, I would say it's very unlikely that you've got that much magnetite in your system that it's stopping your radiators from working. Having said that, magnetite can build up and cause a blockage in the pipework which will stop a radiator from working. But again, I generally only really find this on very old systems. Now, whilst we're talking about blocked pipes, it is possible that you can have a bubble of air, which is literally just sat in a pipe and it's not letting the water flow through the pipework. And so your radiator's not getting hot. To test this theory is fairly straightforward. All I would do is go around and turn off all of the radiators. So turn off every radiator apart from that one radiator which is not getting hot. If you've got a traditional system or you've got any kind of other pump on the central heating system, I would then look to put that pump into its full speed mode so it gets the most amount of force pushed around the system. And 3 is the most powerful setting, so that's where I'm setting this pump. If you've got a combination boiler or a system boiler, you won't be able to adjust the speed of the pump which is in the boiler. Now, if you do have some air in the system and it's stopping the radiator from working, you'll hear a funny gurgling sound or maybe trickling, and then hopefully the radiator will then suddenly start working as the bubble of air gets pushed out of the pipework. This may also work if you've got a bit of a blockage in the system, so a bit of magnetites build up and it's not letting the water flow through. By closing all the radiators, that puts all the force of the pump to pump all the water through that one bit of pipework, and then it might just clear away that blockage and get the radiator working again. Now, if once you've closed all the radiator valves, that radiator starts getting hot without any problem, but then when you open the valves up again, that problem radiator goes cold or just lukewarm again, then that's most likely this system just needs to be balanced. Now, balancing the system is pretty straightforward, and I have made a video explaining how to balance your system, and it will also make your system way more efficient, and hopefully you'll end up with all your radiators getting hot all at the same time. Now, if all that fails, the last thing to do is to start taking things apart. Now, one of my customers a couple of years ago, he had a radiator in his sort of extension part of his house. The pipework went underneath the floor and it's been gradually getting cooler and cooler when it was finally just about lukewarm. Now, this is the actual radiator. My kind customer let me go back and just make a film of it, especially for this video. But I'll be demonstrating on a different radiator because obviously this one is nice and hot now. Now, I'd already tried doing everything which I previously mentioned, so the radiator's been bled, both radiator valves are fully open, and I'd also been around the rest of the system, turned off all the other radiators by closing the radiator valves to force the water to go through this one radiator, but still the radiator was staying lukewarm. So now I wanted to flush the pipework out. So I wanted to flush out the flow and the return pipe and try and clear out any blockage that was in the pipework and get the radiator working again. So that's going to involve taking things apart. Just before I show you how to flush out that pipework, let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Mark Ballard. I've been a gas resident engineer for over 30 years. I make help videos to help you with your gas boiler and your heating. If you do find this video useful, then please give me a bit of feedback by clicking on that thumbs up, and that will help others to find the video. Click on subscribe, ring on the bell to get a notification, and of course share the video with your friends. And a really big thank you to everybody who buys me a cup of coffee and leaves me a small donation in my toolbox fund. It is really appreciated and it does help me to make more videos which will hopefully help you. Now, this older radiator doesn't have those large blanking plugs on the top. I'll show you a way of using these blanking plugs instead of removing the radiator valve in just a minute. So now I'm going to remove one of the radiator valves from the problem radiator. Now, with this bit of pipework I had plenty of movement. As you can see, this pipe is not clipped to anything. After I removed the valve, I just blocked up the radiator with a bit of kitchen roll just to stop the water from continuously glugging out of the radiator. I then got my trusty water vacuum. I put it onto the radiator valve and then I opened the radiator valve fully open and then basically sucked the water through that pipe. This was on an old system which had been converted to a combi boiler system. So I also put the pressure up really high so I could get the maximum flow through that bit of 15mm pipework. Hopefully this is going to clear any blockage that may be in this pipe. Once I was satisfied I got enough flow through that bit of pipe, I then wanted to do the same to the other pipe. So I'll now close this radiator valve and then I can use my vacuum and put it onto the radiator. I'll then open up the radiator valve at the other end of the radiator, and that's now going to blast out that bit of pipework. And then hopefully that's going to clean out any blockage in that bit of pipework and also in the bottom of the radiator. Now, if you don't have a water vacuum, you can always attach a hose pipe to your radiator valve and radiator. You can see here I've rotated the radiator valve around, so I can then fit the hose pipe onto the radiator valve with a bit of extra copper pipe. And then once I've flushed that bit of pipework out, I can then attach the hose pipe onto the radiator and then open the valve up at the other end, flushing out the other bit of pipework. Now, if you've got one of those radiator valves where you have a large union, You can't attach a hose pipe onto it, but you can use an old washing machine hose. It's like a perfect fit. You'll then have to use the valve at the other end of the radiator to flush the other bit of pipework out, or you could use a washing machine connector like this, but you might have to make some adjustments to it. Now, going back to that original radiator, I don't know what the blockage was, but what I can say for sure is that 2 years on, that radiator is still nice and hot. And somewhere in that 9 meters of pipework that went underneath the floor and along the wall and up into the ceiling, there was some kind of blockage. And by using my vacuum and the maximum pressure I could get, I managed to clear that blockage. Now, I had to remove the radiator valve because this radiator has a rounded top and it doesn't have these blanking plugs like on most radiators. It only has a small bleed screw which is built into the radiator. So an easy method for doing this kind of flushing or blasting through the pipework is to use the blanking plug on the top of the radiator. Then you don't need to remove the radiator valves, which is a lot easier. You still need to close both the radiator valves. You can then remove the blanking plug. You can then put some sort of adapter, or you always use a radiator valve tail, screw that in. Then I can either put a hose pipe onto that, or again, I can just use my vacuum and just suck out that water when I open up a valve. Obviously, I repeat that process for both valves. And again, I've had some very good results using this method. Now, sometimes no matter how much flushing you do, you just can't get that pipework clear and you need to start taking floorboards up and replacing pipework. Now, this is exactly what I had to do to get this towel rail hot again. And it turned out that the plumber who had installed this towel rail had left a blockage in the pipework. And no matter how much flushing I'd have done, I'd have never removed that blockage. If you want to see what that crazy blockage turned out to be, I made a video about that job. Now, if your pipework goes into a concrete floor like this one here does, there's probably not a lot you can do. Now, if your radiator is getting warm, you could put some cleaning chemicals into the system. And if you're lucky, it might clean out that blockage. Now, I've used this method and I've fitted a MagnaClean filter at the same time. It's then really easy to add the chemicals to the filter. The filter then collects that magnetite. Sometimes this method has worked really well, and sometimes not so well. I've also used this method when I come across a main heat exchanger in a boiler that's badly kettling. But it's really worth having a magnetic filter no matter what system you have. They definitely aren't just a gimmick, as I tell all my customers. And this is what you want your filter to look like, hardly any magnetite on it at all. So I know that this system will be in pretty good condition. If all that fails, then sometimes the only option is to run some new pipework, which might look something like this. You can always box it in and paint the pipework, and it may work out to be cheaper and easier in the long run. So just to sum up, first of all, check that the radiator is actually turned on. Both valves are open. Check your thermostatic radiator valve. If you've got one of those, make sure that that pin is going up and down. Bleed the radiator, make sure that there's no air in the radiator. If it's still not hot, then try closing all the other radiator valves on your system, leaving the problem radiator valves open, and see if that clears the blockage or gets the radiator hot. If there's just a bit of air or a very small blockage in the pipework, then hopefully closing all the radiator valves will push that through and your radiator will start getting hot. Now, if when you open the other radiator valves back up again, it goes cold again or just lukewarm, then it's most likely the system just needs to be balanced. If after doing some balancing, it's still cold, you can then start taking valves off and doing the flushing method like I showed you. You can try replacing the radiator valves because sometimes they become faulty and they don't open properly. Now, if the water blasts out of one of the pipes and only trickles out of the other one, it's most likely you have a blockage in that bit of pipework. Now, you can persevere and try using some chemicals and cleaning out the pipework that way. Or sometimes it might just be better to start again and to replace the pipework altogether. If the pipework's underneath floorboards, you can probably get to that reasonably easily, but if it's in a concrete floor, you're probably best off starting again. Right, that's about it then. So I do hope my video has been helpful to you. If you want to watch my video on that blockage in the pipework, you can click on the link just there. If you want to know more about the thermostatic radiator valves, click on that video just there. You can click on subscribe, ring on the bell, share it with your friends, give me a thumbs up, and as always, my toolbox friend. Bye for now. See you next time.